No, I'm tripping. It wasn't the 12th. It was the 14th when George McClellan decided to re-link up with John Pope's army. And then a day before that, on the 13th, is when General James Longstreet finally linked up with Stonewall Jackson at Gordonsville, and that's where they waited until like the 22nd. The 22nd is when the next major battle took place. Again, this is leading up to the 29th and the 30th. On the 22nd is when the Union and Confederate troops ended up fighting, but along the Rappahannock River, but more so like along the western portion of the river, over there next to Fredericksburg or whatnot. That fighting took place for about 3 days, from the 22nd to the 25th. And then, let me see, the very next day after that, on the 26th. Now, this is when events become a little bit more important, leading up to the 29th and the 30th of the second battle with Manassas. The 26th is when Confederate troops under Stonewall Jackson, of course, attacked Bristol Station. And when they attacked Bristol Station, that's when they sabotaged the railroad, the Orange and Alexander Railroad, and they wrecked, I believe, about 2 trains and then like several miles of tracks. They, sabotaged or whatever, just to prevent the Union from reinforcing John Pope and George McClellan at the time. So then later on during that night, really literally, you could say on the 27th, but sometime like after midnight, you could say on the 27th, is when they attacked Manassas. As I mentioned before, I was kind of confused at first because I still don't know at one point from this point on, well, from that point, going reverse in chronological order, did the Union soldiers eventually occupy Manassas Junction. But that's when they attacked them. It was a light garrison, or a garrison really, of Union soldiers there, and the Confederates overran them and imprisoned about 300 of them, and then took about 8 cannons that they had. So that was the morning of the 27th, again after midnight, but still at night. The next day, John Pope found out about this, and well, actually, yeah, when they attacked Manassas, I forgot to mention, as far as the Confederates, Stonewall Jackson left a guy by the name of General Isaac Trimble, I believe his last name is, but General Isaac, he left him there. And then as far as like when they went back to Bristol Station, he left factions of the Union soldiers under General Ewell Richardson. And like I say, later on throughout the day, that's when John Pope found out about this or whatnot, and he left. Well, before he left where he was at, he decided to send like a couple of regiments there to attack the Confederate soldiers. He had ordered one to come from Washington. I believe that was the New York Heavy Regiment, as they were called, something like that. The New York Heavy Artillery. That's the name of this regiment that came from Washington, D.C., as well as other regiments under 2 generals. One, his name was George Taylor, and then the other guy had a funny name, E. Parker Scammon, S-C-A-M-M-O-N. And he left, you know what I'm saying, as far as John Pope. He went east because his mind was more so focused on Stonewall Jackson. I think if this didn't occur on the 27th, I mean, the 27th, it definitely occurred on the 28th, because there was a lot of fighting that went on the 27th. I think that same day on the 27th, at another place called Browner's Farm, Stonewall Jackson, which is, like I said, a little farther east. That's like between this unfinished railroad, as it was called, because you got this place called Stony Ridge, which is where Stonewall Jackson kind of settled at, and then I would say like south if not, if I think it's kind of, if not slightly southwest, southeast, but definitely south of Stony Ridge. But south of this unfinished railroad is where Browner's Farm was at, and Stonewall Jackson is mentioned as attacking there, and it was a stalemate pretty much. But as far as going back to Manassas Junction, okay, these regiments that John Pope has sent there, I think, yeah, Stonewall Jackson also sent men to reinforce them as well at Manassas Junction, and there's 2 generals that's mentioned from the side of the Confederates that he sent there. One, his name was William Talia Furrow, and then another guy named A.P. Hill. Now I know what I forgot to mention as far as the knife, because again my phone cut off, so this is me doing this, you know, saying continuing this vlog or whatnot. I forgot to mention as far as the knife, when you know, just before, like 5 days before George McClellan moved out from Harris's Landing, on the knife, as the Confederates were heading toward Gordonsville, they ended up getting attacked at Cedar Mountain, and they got attacked by Nathaniel Banks. Now remember, Nathaniel Banks is the guy that fought in Louisiana, that, you know, say that's the same guy that I mentioned, the racist guy that, you know, made sure that all of the black soldiers were taken out of the 2nd Louisiana Native Guard, but he was unsuccessful as far as the 1st and 3rd. But he is mentioned as attacking them there at Cedar Mountain. And as far as him, he kind of succeeded, but he eventually got repelled by A.P. Hill and sent back across Cedar Creek. Now, one thing I want to mention also about Cedar Mountain is because I think it's notable, when I was reading about them, this is when they brought up Robert Good Shaw. Remember, that's the guy that led the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. I didn't know that he fought as well at Cedar Mountain, and he had made a mention as far as his writings. He was saying like he was quite impressed, because he had there were a lot of Bostonians that fought there as well. As far as him, he himself, he had led the regiment that he led was called the 2nd Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment, and he was impressed at the bravery of these soldiers, because a good amount of them didn't come from like a poor background. They came from you know, pretty good upbringing. A lot of them were educated or whatever, and he noted how brave they were and how they would put themselves on the line to be killed, or basically put themselves in great peril, knowing, I mean, this is not the words that he mentioned, but these were people who were valued pretty much. So I thought that was interesting or whatnot. The Confederates still eventually made it back to Gordonsville. Now fast forward and going back to the 27th or whatever, as far as by the time A.P. Hill made it to Manassas, the fighting had started already. Now, even though they didn't mention this specifically, I just think, like, you know, as far as like the 2nd New York, or the New York Heavy Artillery, that's the name of this regiment, the New York Heavy Artillery, I believe that they were the ones who had already started fighting with the against the Confederates there, and A.P. Hill still made it there and eventually reinforced the Confederates. And then shortly after that is when George Taylor arrived there. Supposedly he made it there through a railroad, through train or whatnot. By the time he made it there, the Confederates are said to have, you know, they were pretty much winning the battle. They were efficient or whatnot. And then shortly after that is when E. Parker Scamone made it there. By the time he made it there, he pretty much, you know, the Union had already decided to retreat. So he pretty much just served as a facilitator for the Union to retreat. As far as the casualties, again, like I said, the Confederates won that battle, but I think they killed like 250, I think it was like 250 Union soldiers that got killed, and about 150 of them were imprisoned. Now, as far as I guess you could say simultaneous events as far as going back to Ewell Richardson, or Richard Ewell, that's his name, the guy that was left as the head of the Confederate soldiers at Bristol Station. He decided to move a little further west or whatnot, along this place called Kettle Run. And some of the Union factions had made it there too. A guy that's noted that fought against him is a guy by the name of General Joseph Hooker, and he was the head of the 3rd Corps Regiment that fought against these Confederate factions or whatever. The fighting supposedly started around 2:00 p.m. and it lasted for about like 2 hours. By the time 4:00 p.m. came, the Confederate soldiers had received the order from Stonewall Jackson to retreat and head back toward Manassas, but also by the time to once they get to Manassas, to burn the supplies there or whatnot. And going back to John Pope, when he had left, like I say, he was more focused on pursuing Stonewall Jackson at the time. Now, he also had intel before he left that General James Longstreet was heading that way to Thoroughfare Gap. And, you know, I guess he kind of like looked at him as like, I mean, small fries, you know what I'm saying? Like he looked at him as not being a big deal. So he kind of just, as far as John Pope, he left to still go pursue Stonewall Jackson. So that happened. The very next day on the 28th is when James Longstreet made it there to Thoroughfare Gap. And of course, he was able to break through the Union soldiers there. And then once he was successful in that endeavor is when he decided to head back to re-link up with Stonewall Jackson. Now, fast forwarding to the 29th, this is an important day. This is when John Pope finally made it to where Stonewall Jackson was at. Now, at this point is when they were fighting along this unfinished railroad. And, you know, he initiated his attacks or whatever. And these attacks were repulsed. You know, it kind of went on for a little certain amount of time. And by the time he kind of, you know, decided to hold off for a second is when General James Longstreet finally made it to Stonewall Jackson. When he made it to Stonewall Jackson is when the fighting for that particular day was over with. But the very next day is when John Pope decided to, you know, to continue to attack them as far as attacking Stonewall Jackson. By this time, I want to say, like, one thing that was notable during this whole conflict, as far as on the 30th, it is mentioned that the Union flanks were crushed or something like that. And then James Longstreet, along with 5 divisions collectively, decided to initiate a massive attack against the Union position, in which they were so successful to the point where where John Pope decided to retreat. And so overall, they ended up losing this major second battle of Manassas. Now, when they lost this battle, I think they once again kind of like ended up going across Bull Run River or something like that. But as far as like the Confederates, they were successful. This is when Robert E. Lee is mentioned as deciding to head further fucking northeast and head into Maryland at this point. And as far as like how this is conceptualized, this is what started the Maryland campaign. They had one more fight before he eventually went further into Maryland, and this took place September the 1st. And it was called the Battle of Ox Hill. The actual name of the place is called Chantilly. That is also north of Centralville. I can't remember if I'm not sure if Chantilly is within the bounds of Maryland. I know I believe it's more so close to it or whatnot. I think it's still in Richmond, Virginia, northern Richmond, Virginia. Now pause it for a second. As far as in Europe at this point, because I don't want to forget to continue talking about Maria Rosetta O'Neill. As far as like the British at this point, you know, they were kind of like not necessarily instigating, but pondering from the start of this war whether to intervene. And the news of the Second Battle of Manassas finally made it to them sometime during the beginning of September. Now, the Prime Minister, aside from Queen Victoria, of course, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time was a guy named Henry John Temple. He had became the Prime Minister in again, I want to make sure I'm not covering up my audio. This phone is iffy. He became the Prime Minister of Britain in 1859. From 1859, I believe, up until 1865. Under him was another guy named Earl Russell, whose real name is John Russell. He was the Foreign Secretary of Britain at the time. Both of them had talks that they were kind of, they decided to have a cabinet meeting to decide whether or not to intervene. If they chose to intervene, a part of their intention would be to overall recognize the Confederacy. Because as far as the Confederacy, like, I'm just going to explain this for further context. When the war started, like, remember I mentioned as far as that embargo that Abraham Lincoln decided to implement in April of 1861. Shortly after that, probably just a couple of months after that, the specific date I couldn't find, and I tried my best to research, but basically sometime during the midsummer is when the Confederacy under Jefferson Davis decided to implement their own embargo as well. Same shit, basically. I was kind of confused on that because I'm like, if Abraham Lincoln initiated this embargo as far as blocking, because remember the South were the major distributors of cotton, and Britain bought a large portion of their cotton from the South as well as other countries as well. As far as like the actual number, Britain bought about 80% of their cotton from the fucking South. I mean, from America. And again, this is primarily coming from the South or whatever. So I was kind of confused, like, in what way, like, how the fuck can the Union initiate a embargo and then the South turn around and do the same thing? But as far as the intentions of this, Lincoln's intention was to basically choke up the Southern economy. As far as like Jefferson Davis, he initiated this embargo because he was looking for like the Confederacy to receive recognition from Britain, kind of like during the American Civil War, not the Civil War, but like the American Revolutionary War. As far as because it's similar to like Holland, the Netherlands, for example. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know how like in 1774, like, let me see, around August and October is when a lot of private companies were distributing arms and military wear to the Americans at the time. And the British felt some type of way about that, to where they ended up kind of, this is what led to the British, you know, attacking St. Eustatius, as well as a lot of holes throughout West Africa that belonged to the Netherlands at the time. But a good amount of the weapons, like as far as like the siege of Boston at the time and the Battle of Lexington and Concord, a lot of those weapons were gained from the Netherlands at the time. A lot of private trade had went on. It's similar to this. The South wanted recognition or whatever, and they felt like that would help them gain recognition. But based on I read, it didn't work. But still, what made it such, I don't even want to call it a paradox, but what confused my fucking mind is this. Even though the South had implemented its own embargo, overall, as far as throughout the entirety of the fucking war, 60% of the cotton that was still produced from the South made it into Britain. You know what I'm saying? Like, it had got to a point where the British had to look elsewhere to receive their cotton. And then there was a little famine that had took place in a place called Manchester, England, specifically the town called Lancashire or whatnot, as well as Liverpool, England. Because, let me see, I think in 1860 it's mentioned that a great amount of cotton will arrive through Liverpool, England as well. But still, I was just like, when I was thinking about it, I'm like, okay, I understand recognition, but why would you initiate this embargo as far as from the South, yet you still use cotton, and it turned out 60% of it to trade with private companies from Britain for military arms and shit like that, because it's like over 10 different private companies that I read about, but I remember the names, or at least 2 of them. One was called John Laird and Sons. Laird would be L-A-I-R-D and Sons. And then another one called Trenholm, Fraser and Company. And I believe the latter is where a ship called CSS Alabama, a warship, I think they were the ones responsible for providing this particular warship to the Confederacy, but the Confederacy received a lot of warship and steamships, and they will also use these steamships to help trade cotton, even though it wasn't really designed for that. Like these steamships couldn't really carry that much cotton, but these steamships, like, because of this blockade on their ports, you know, they were able to outrun a lot of these Union steamships and boats and ships as well, you know what I'm saying, in the midst of them trading back and forth. So it was like just fucking kind of confusing to me. But anyway, that to me is similar to the American Revolutionary War as far as the dynamic of trade. Only difference is the South never gained, throughout the whole entire war, all the way up to 1865, the South never gained recognition, as opposed to the Americans at the time, who did finally gain recognition from the Netherlands, the country that whose private tiers that they were trading with for military arms. And as like a further note, like I mentioned, I think in 1774, even before the First Continental Congress, which took place in September of 1774, like I said, in August, you know, that's when the Americans had started trading with these privateers from the Netherlands or whatnot. And November of that same year, it almost skipped my mind, is when in Amsterdam, it is mentioned that they had saluted the flag of an American ship at the time, and that's what pissed off the British even more. But still, only fucking, what, 7 years after that, in 1781, April to be exact, is when the Netherlands officially recognized America as a sovereign nation, being the second country to do that. And they did it when they recognized, like, you know, they gave credit to John Quincy Adams' father's signature at the time, because he was in Amsterdam. But again, going back, fast forwarding back to the Civil War, they never recognized the South, though they pondered about it and got pretty close to it, because, like I say, after the first battle of Manassas, the Prime Minister, Henry John Temple, and then the Foreign Secretary, Earl Russell, or John Russell, they decided to have this cabinet meeting later on in the month after this, you know, after like the results of this Maryland campaign came to fruition, you know what I'm saying? But they eventually decided to hold out a little longer. Now, it was another guy, he was a politician. He ended up becoming a prime minister too. I don't remember exactly what year, but his name was William Gladstone of Britain. He was also kind of criticized later on because, like, he had wrote to this lady called damn, what was her name? The Mistress of Sutherland, I believe. And he basically just gave his opinion. He was saying, like, he disagreed with Jefferson Davis's whole premise for this war, as far as, like, him believing that the black man was not superior, but inferior to the white man. Therefore, slavery was something that was righteous and wouldn't be immoral or whatever. Like, he didn't believe in the superiority thing, but he was criticized for kind of like having, you know, some of his words kind of showed that he leaned in favor toward the South. And I don't want to jump the gun, but I'm just going to mention it ahead of time so I don't forget. Sometime in October, this same guy, William Gladstone, had gave a speech in Ireland. The place is called Newcastle, Ireland. And again, he spoke about this war that was going on, and how, you know, Britain might have to intervene. Again, keeping in mind that intervention strictly meant recognizing the South, not necessarily stepping in and lending arms and shit. Well, I guess it could potentially snowball into that, but at least recognizing the South. And the American ambassador to Britain at the time, again, was John Quincy Adams' son, Charles Francis Adams. He made it publicly known. He communicated this to both Britain, but also, you know, he made it publicly known in the United States as well that it would be considered a dangerous move. And if they were to recognize the fucking South, it would cause great friction between the United States and Britain. And they would take further steps as far as, like, you know, sanctions toward Britain as well. So these were some of the things that was going on. Now, still keeping in mind, as far as Maria Rosetta O'Neill, who later on became like a Confederate ambassador to Britain. I'm gonna get on her in a second, but I don't want to, you know, skip the loop. But this is like the context that was going on during this time period. So, okay, so after that last battle, as far as September the 1st, the Battle of Ox Hill, on the 3rd is when the Confederates decided to move further into Maryland or whatever. And they also decided to split their army. Now, George McClellan was reinforced by this time. So as far as like the number of men that he had with him that also moved into Maryland, he had about 102,000 men. As far as the Confederates, they had about a little bit over 50,000, but basically half of what George McClellan had. They decided to, as far as the Confederacy, split their army still and attack Harper's Ferry, as well as move into Maryland. Now, as far as Harper's Ferry, they attacked and captured it, and the battle or the fight there lasted for about 3 days, from the 12th of September up until the 15th of September. Now, going back to not George McClellan, well, yeah, I guess you could say George McClellan still, George McClellan and John Pope. As far as them, they decided to move where these Confederates were at the time. And they went through a place called South Mountain. That took place on the 14th. Little fighting happened. Around this time, it gave the Confederates enough time to move further north. And this is when they went to a place called Sharpsburg, Maryland. Now, it is also nicknamed Antietam. This was that was a notable battle, as far as like what I mentioned about like the British politicians kind of like pondering whether or not to intervene and recognize the Confederacy. This was like a major battle that helped them make a decision. Like it was a make or break decision. It turned out that battle ended up it's mentioned that it ended up a tie, but it ended up as a tie, but enough of a victory for the Union to, I guess you could say, turn off Britain from recognizing the Confederacy. This was also communicated by Lincoln because, let me see, that battle took place on the 17th of September. And it is noted as like the day of the most fucking casualties of or deaths in a single day, as far as in the battle during the Civil War. About 22,000 men had died that day. After that battle, I want to say the very next day is this. Yeah, this is what made the battles, like, even though it's considered a tie, this is what made it kind of like somewhat of a victory for the fucking Union at the time, because it's what made Robert E. Lee decide to leave Maryland. For the Confederate soldiers to leave Maryland and cross the Potomac, and this is what they did the very next day on the 18th. Now, after that, on the 19th and the 20th is when the last two battles had took place, and it took place at a place called Shepherdstown, and that was shit. That's what pretty much it as far as that. After that point, that's when it was publicly. Not publicly, but that's when Lincoln was able to kind of sit down, rest on his hands, and not have to worry about the British, you know, deciding to intervene or recognize the Confederacy in any way, shape, or form or whatnot. So then that's like the last of my research. Actually, no, it's not. It's one more thing I forgot to mention as far as the very fucking next year, which would be 1863. The second battle of Fort Wagner, which took place July 11th. Now, 2 months before that, like I said, you got the the military act that was passed a year before that in July. So black soldiers were already enlisted in the Union Army, but I think the exact date for this also would be May the 22nd, is when the military passed. Like what was it? This is when they established the first Bureau of Colored Troops. It was established through an order called Order 143, something like that. Yeah, Order number 143, and that is what engendered the first 51st All-Black Regiment, the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. Even though like they were kind of like called for even prior to that, I believe in October of 1862 as well. Now this is when I bring back up Robert Good Shaw. He was chosen to lead this regiment. He was kind of like iffy about it at first. He didn't want to leave the first one that I mentioned, as far as like the 2nd Massachusetts Regiment. He felt like he'll be abandoning his soldiers or whatever. But ultimately, he decided to take this gig. And it was a little bit of a conflict as far as like the pay. You know, he kind of issued a strike or whatever until, you know, the black soldiers received, almost equal pay with the white soldiers, as well as the proper military gear or whatnot. Now, my only other source for thinking about this, again, is that movie Glory. I believe, because when you look at like if you're fortunate to still have like a copy of the DVD, look at the extra features, you know, they still really didn't end up getting the same type of pay, or the pay that they were initially promised. But based on what I read, they supposedly did or whatever. So Robert Goodshaw eventually led this regiment, and the first battle of Fort Wagner took place on the 4th of July. His regiment wasn't a part of this battle, but I think like at this time, you know, the Confederates had a certain amount of siege guns, about nine siege guns, I believe, and the number of soldiers, as far as the Confederate soldiers that occupied Fort Wagner, were about 1,600, soldiers, and these Union soldiers attacked them, but they ended up losing, obviously, and incurred a lot of casualties. It was like 339 casualties on the side of the Union soldiers. As far as the Confederacy, they only suffered like 11 deaths. So going 7 days later to July 11th is when the 54th Massachusetts Regiment attacked them there, and it was about 5,000 of them, because like I say, they were in tangent with other regiments, but collectively altogether they numbered about 5,000, and they only took the fort for like an hour, and it eventually got killed off, basically, almost. And I think their casualties numbered about 1,800